Well, I'm going to start by saying thank you to the director and the trustees and the staff at the gallery for allowing us to hold this conference here today. I'm Mike Scott. I'm a fellow at Blackfriars Hall in Oxford, and I'm also the senior advisor to the president of Georgetown University and director of the Georgetown University Future of the Humanities Project. What is this project about? It's about the future of the humanities and the arts. That's what it's about. Why should we have it? Well, on both sides of the Atlantic, we are facing a situation whereby utilitarianism and materialism and the desire for wealth creation is actually forcing a pressure on the humanities and forcing the humanities out of education. So we decided that it's about time that some of us on both sides of the Atlantic started to say, actually, the arts and the humanities are essential for the development and the education of our people. I remember when I first came into university education back in 1974, so the mathematicians start to work out how old I am, but back in 1974, Sir Charles Groves made a speech in which he said to government, "You neglect the arts at your peril." And that is what we do. We neglect the arts at our peril. The arts and the humanities are a civilizing force within our world. Of course, other subjects are as well, but we mustn't let the arts and humanities be put in a situation whereby money, the desire for wealth, starts to squeeze out the arts and the humanities from our educational programs. And no more is this important, so important, as with art and art history. You probably have read about the attack on art history as an A-level subject within the UK. I'm afraid that I have to say that Professor Martin Kemp has been taken ill overnight and can't be with us today. But if he had been here, he was going to talk about the way that it was in danger at the universities itself. I hope he'll be able to make that up at some future date, but I heard only this morning that he was unwell. So that is what we're about. We're trying to promote on both sides of the Atlantic this whole issue of putting the humanities and putting the arts on the agenda. And Georgetown University, and I'm delighted that Dr. Tom Banchoff is here, who's the Vice President of Georgetown University, and other members of Georgetown University, both of faculty and also alumni here in the UK, are present with us today. Georgetown have been absolutely so generous in sponsoring the whole project. And indeed initiating it. So that's what the project is about, and we're going to talk today about art history and about art, and we have with us some wonderful figures in the world of art, both in terms of curating and in terms of making art. They're chaired by Stephen Farthing, Fellow of the Royal Academy, such a distinguished artist in his own right, known throughout the country as one of our leading artists. And he's going to chair the whole of the afternoon and the discussions. So I'm going to hand over to him, and then he will introduce our wonderful panel as well. Thank you very much. Thank you for coming. Thank you.
Now, as Mike has already said, that Martin won't be with us, which slightly unbalances our aim, which was to have some makers and some curators. And the makers and curators thing is quite important, I think, in terms of understanding what art might be, in that every now and then people are moved to ask what art is. And André Malraux, I believe he was the first ever Minister of Culture in France during the mid-20th century, when asked this question, said, "It's what you find in galleries and museums." From which I cunningly have deduced that curators and museum keepers and art historians decide what art is, because they're the people who decide what goes into museums. It's seldom the audience and it's seldom the artists. All artists want to be in museums. Looking at it from the other direction, but coming up with a very similar result, first page or two of Gombrich's Story of Art, he asks himself the question, what is art? And he says it is what artists make. So this panel is structured such that we take both guys into consideration. I don't know whether they're right or not, but they're operating in an area that is plausible, I think. So no Martin Kemp, unfortunately, but Daphne, who is a portrait painter, an eminent portrait painter, and I think that the important thing about Daphne Todd, to me, as an artist, is that she is a professional portrait painter and artist. She paints fantastic pictures. Go online and have a look. She's got a great website with tons and tons of paintings that she's made over a period of time. Some of people that even I recognise, because they're mostly rich and very important. And so Daphne is going to start the proceedings and talk about the relevance of portrait painting now. And then after Daphne, Estelle Thompson, who is again a distinguished artist who I think we studied at the Royal College of Art around about the same time, maybe not totally, but certainly our paths crossed at the Royal College. And Estelle is going to talk about, well, the title of her talk is Analogue Artworks in a Digital Age, which I suspect will cover a very, very important area today, which is that, I can almost give you the exact date, 1995, computers turned up in art schools in a big way. The internet reared its head. The moving image became accessible to everyone at home, and the editing of moving images was possible on computers using software that you could go and buy in your local Dixons or somewhere. And so our ability to interface with the making of visual stuff was totally changed as from about 1995, 96. At that point, nobody knew how to teach digital imaging in art schools. There were very few computers. There were golf ball typewriters that we were all very proud of that could rethink second sentences, and you could change the typeface by taking an enormous lump of metal out of them and putting them in. And so it's absolutely central to what is happening, or what has happened over the last 20 or 30 years, is the area that Estelle will talk about. And then finally, Kathleen, who kicks off with a quote from an American. I'll leave it to her to tell you what the quote is, but she's going to talk about truth and beauty in a troubled time, which seems entirely appropriate to me. My job is to smile, listen, take copious notes and try and ask some interesting questions to get the second part of the proceedings in place. So, like you should be doing the same job as me, taking copious notes and getting ready for the open discussion. So, Daphne, thank you very much. Could you come and tell us about portrait painting?
I'm quite clearly here under false pretenses. The title for this, I was told, was The Relevance of Art History, and everyone is extremely academic. I am not. I'm a practitioner. So I suspect I've been invited because I'm living history, not just my age, which is over 70, but the fact that I am still practicing an archaic practice, if you like. I hate that word, actually, but an archaic way of going about making art. In other words, I and many of my colleagues at the Royal Society of Portrait Painters still work from observation, directly in front of the subject. Many people have said, and amazingly to me still say, that you don't need portrait painters ever since photography was invented. and you can take selfies, and you just don't need a painter to record appearances. But what is the difference between painting from photographs, as some people do? There's a point to that, up to a very small point to that, because paint will last for hundreds, if not thousands of years. We don't quite know what's going to happen to photographs and everything digital. Though no doubt they'll find a way of preserving the good bits, but there's so much of it. So what is the difference? A camera sees things in ways that we do not. If you take a snap of a friend on holiday and you bring it home and weeks later you have a look at it, there'll be all sorts of things in that photograph that you have not seen. Bits of rubbish flowing around behind, mountains that you didn't notice were there, someone sneaking in behind someone else that you didn't notice was there. You know, the camera has recorded an instant, and we don't see like that. Our relationship, when we're looking at something, is a dynamic one. It's active. We have a visceral response, and it may be, you know, between the legs, it may be in the heart, it may be in the head, but it's bodily. So there's a bodily thing happening when we're looking at something directly. Our eyes are accommodating, they're peering into the farther reaches, they're re-accommodating if they go into a light area or the dark area, so they can see different things in different illuminations. And that experience is what informs a painter that paints from life. Now, the problems of painting from life, of course, is that life is three-dimensional and happens throughout time, and a painter is merely making something that's flat and fixed, fixed in time. So what is this painting? What is it that we're picking out? We're picking out various details that seem to us to be important. It's a much, much richer experience than working from anything that's dead or flat. It's richer, actually, than working from drawings, even though the exhibition that many of you will have just seen, the drawing element was brilliant. You know, you could follow each little twig, and he'd observe that twig, and some of them were snapped off and some were not. You know, he clearly spent a lot of time looking at the actual world in front of him. It's just as clear to me that he went away and then painted the painting somewhere else, because there are inconsistencies, and all the things that happen when you're out in a landscape, the wind blowing and the sun moving round and changing. I mean, those sunsets, you only have about 10 minutes to paint a sunset, so you could not work in that way in front of the motif. But of course, various artists have worked in front of the motif, starting with, Cézanne clearly did, Giacometti did. Do we need people to be painting as I do? Well, I don't know whether we need people like me, but you're certainly going to get people like me. And I'm sorry I'm boring you, the person who just yawned. But if you hold it, I could paint it. Now let's think about the experience of painting from observation. If you have a still life, it's quite difficult to make the thing look solid and as though it's inhabiting a space. You're having to make an illusion. Quite difficult to get the proportions right or wrong. But if you're painting a human, everybody knows whether you've got the proportions right or wrong. Everybody knows that if that figure stands up, the arms are going to drag along the ground, or the head is too small. We are all critics. And if you take that one stage further and look at the face, you're all staring at my face, not my feet, not my shoulders, not the other people. You're looking at my face, because we're imparting so much more information with that. So we're always going to be interested in faces. Now, all the problems of painting from life are magnified when you sit someone down and try and paint another human being. Because not only is everything moving, even if they're trying to keep still, they're moving in possibly every possible way. So not only might they be over there or over there compared to their background, they also are moving like this, so their head is moving round. And on top of all of that moving about, the surface is moving about on top. And the light is probably changing, even if you've got an electric light, that cuts it down a bit, but the fact that you've changed, the facets are differently angled at the light will make the shapes that are coming to your eye enormously complicated. Vast numbers of shapes are coming to the artist's eye. So when people talk about merely copying appearances, as they do, in a rather derisory way, in fact, I heard a tutor from the Slade only last year sitting on a selection panel with myself for a national sending competition, dismissing quite a lot of the art as saying, merely copying appearances. Well, from everything I've just said, with all of this, what is the appearance? What is mere? What is copying? So I think it's incredibly important that we keep hold of this experience, which is almost gone from many of our art colleges. It's taught in very, very few places. And there are all sorts of technical ways of helping artists get this three-dimensional, moving, living world down onto a flat surface. And art teachers should be there helping them. But some of them don't know about the angle of vision, that everything's going to be distorted outside that area. They don't know that perspective is a device that helps somebody make an illusion of 3 dimensions, but it's not your human experience at the time. Nonetheless, when you're painting, you're going to have to cope with the fact that when you're looking up at somebody, or at the surroundings behind them, or you're looking down, you're going to get those perspectives going in all of these directions. So it's multidimensional. And that's what's exciting about it, and why I think it should be taught. And I think it should be taught immersively, so that every student at some point in their art education should have a term, at least, where they're dealing with portraiture. They can deal with it digitally. They can deal with it in all sorts of ways. I think that probably the best way is to have different practitioners talking to those students, because yes, they're going to use digital media, yes, they're going to use photographs. You can make art out of anything, and I'm not saying one way is better than another, but working from direct observation is something that relates to everybody else. And art isn't just for curators and museums, art is for people. And when you put on an exhibition of portraits, people come to it. Even in deadly little provincial galleries, they come to it, and they have a view as to whether you've got it right or wrong. And they're usually right about whether it's right or wrong. So there's no way that one wants to go back to teaching a method. There are private art schools that do that, and they're stuck somewhere back in the 19th century. I'm not for that at all. But any student who has the experience with a little help and guidance to work from life and go into it deeply is going to be led into all of these other areas. What is it that they are trying to catch from that experience? And somebody will be catching shapes and colours. They certainly, because we can tell whether we've got it right or wrong, whether you've got a likeness or not, they certainly will be more sensitive to colours, more sensitive to changes in shape if they have this experience. And all artists, whatever persuasion, are actually intended to be better than the rest of the population, more sensitive to colour, more sensitive to shape and proportion. and working from a living model, another human being, is interminably interesting. And you've only to think that in the last century, you've got people as different as Cézanne, slabby portraits, or, and I always forget names, so I'm having to look, Modigliani, doing something very stylized, or Giacometti, moving a little bit nearer our own time, existential angst, just grey, just choosing what he wants from that experience. Hugely different, all masters, and then in our own time, which is just about passing, and maybe it's right that this won't matter anymore, but I don't think that's true. But in our own time, we've just lost Freud and Coldstream. And of course, we still have Hockney. All people who paint portraits. Freud painting very fleshy ones, Hockney painting rather more decorative paintings, and Coldstream being much more controlled and cool about his appraisal of another human being. So if they were doing it that recently and producing work, portraits that everybody admires, of course we should be going on teaching it. So will you? Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. Perhaps I should move a little closer. Is that okay? I'm going to read what I want to say. I would like to reflect on how we look at paintings now and what it is like for students and emerging artists to navigate art and understand art history in the digital age. I considered my own art education in the early 1980s when, within fine art education, the shift from taught art history, not always as survey studies, towards critical theoretical studies had already occurred. Since graduating from the Royal College of Art in 1986, where I was taught, actually, by Stephen, I have taught a generation of emerging artists in a number of British art schools. And as an artist, and like my students, I've also been part of the technological revolution from analogue to digital over the past 2 decades. I perceive this significant shift in our viewing, visual experience, and cognitive analysis in a contemporary world dominated by the screen. It's the balance between the real and the virtual that will be my focus today, as this seems to me a critical challenge for artists now. I do not intend to celebrate one over the other, but I do hope to highlight current trends and potential global changes in the production and reception of art. In preparation for the symposium, my research included online sources, but daily in my inbox and junk mail, they're filled with exhibition notices introducing me to artists whose work I have only ever seen and may only ever know via a screen. I confess to the occasional virtual visit, viewing of contemporary, in the main, commercial shows that I know I can't get to. This easy access to information and visual stimulation is exciting for everyone, including the generation of students, emerging artists, and significantly, the audience for their art. I'm not referring to art that is explicitly made on or for the internet. I'm more interested in what I'm going to term analogue art that includes painting, sculpture, even installation art, that has been digitized and uploaded to be viewable and entirely experienced via the internet. The relatively recent proliferation of art on MySpace, YouTube, Instagram, and Artsy have revolutionised how art is being seen. How do we navigate this miasma of art, often without any accompanying social, economic, or political history? How do we, as makers or as an audience, operate when art objects are viewed as screen images? Artsy is a free online platform where you can buy, inquire, and bid on over 250,000 paintings. Similar sites, ArtPal, Saatchi, Artspa, and curated juried spaces such as Single Art and Artfinder are growing at inordinate speed. These sites chart the careers of artists, act as archives, give context, and are not just about selling art. But as good as this seems, the culture established exerts new pressures for young artists seeking validation, peer recognition, and commercial success. They need to be able to negotiate a global market, be commercially savvy, socially aware, and uniquely creative, all in an instant. There are, of course, online forums and magazines. Daily Art magazine, which bills itself as your daily dose of super interesting art history stories told in the most compelling way, has 8 million followers. I was just informed that as an ICOM member, I have been given free access to 5 of ICOM's museum and heritage-related journals, which is great. Online writing tends to be more skimmable and list-like than print. I recently read an online Guardian article on why you should read this article slowly, arguing that in the analogue era, writing was read much later than it was written. Digital writing is meant for rapid release and response. A text or tweet is a slightly interrupted virtual way of having a conversation. An online article starts forming a comment thread underneath as soon as it's published. This mode of writing and reading can be democratic, interactive, and fun, but often it treats other people's words as something to be quickly harvested as fodder to say something else. Everyone talks over the top of everyone else, straining to be heard. Is there equivalence here to how art is increasingly being made and looked at? Everyone is familiar with Walter Benjamin's essay of cultural criticism, which proposes that the aura of a work of art is devalued by mechanical reproduction. The work of art in the age of mechanical reproduction was first published in 1935, and generations of artists have dealt with questions of reproduction, first in print and now via a screen. Have we become slaves to that compromise? Is this a good or a bad thing? In 2014, the survey exhibition Painting Now, 5 Contemporary Artists at Tate Britain included the painter Simon Ling, who said, "The simple act of observation is a deep, mysterious, and beautiful thing. The camera is so powerful that many people have reached the point where they can only see the world photographically or cinematically and have lost the ability to see it in other ways." In Surface Painting in a Digital Age, writing for rhizome.org, Alex Bacon outlines an emerging trend of painters heavily informed by the internet. He says, "An artist today is automatically involved with ways of looking, thinking, and acting that are conditioned by technology, even if their work is not ostensibly dealing directly with technological concerns." He goes on to suggest a democratization of viewing as the internet serves new audiences. An audience that lacks, indeed does not need, an education or background in the critical and formal examination of art and its history. He goes on to say, this has led to fundamental changes in the way a painting looks, communicates, and circulates, which has in turn attracted a new, younger generation of artists who approach the medium differently than their historical antecedents, deploying it to varied ends. Some of this resonates with comments from fellow artists and students. There is talk of a trend towards painting knowingly made to work on a screen to gain attention and approval or likes online. In terms of art history, today's art students are thrown into the maelstrom of contemporary art and invariably given only a brief and fractured history, an approach noticeably different to that of their predecessors, and the additional education they might search out via random internet searches lacks contextualization and possibly rigorous scholarly input. There are numerous articles and lists about how to make Instagram art, how Instagram became the world's obsession. Can you make it as an artist in 2018 without constantly plugging yourself on Instagram? And the artist's dilemma: refuse the addiction of social media or fail. Other articles already propose, why are these artists quitting Instagram? As a teenager, after swimming in the public baths adjoining Warsaw Gallery of Art's Garman Rhine collection, I would search out Van Gogh's drawing Sorrow. Years later, Bellini's Ecstasy of St. Francis at the Frick, Picasso's Guernica, the Ghent altarpiece, Grunwald's Isenham altarpiece, Giotto's frescoes Cycle in the Scrivini Chapel, Rothko's Chapel in Houston, and Matisse's Chapelle du Rosaire de Vence all had immediate visceral impact and developed my process of looking and cognition. My personal tutor at the Royal College of Art in 1983 was Peter de Francia, a French-born British artist who was Professor of Painting from 1972 to 1986. He was the author of 2 books on Ferdinand Léger, Léger, The Great Parade, Painters on Painting, and Ferdinand Léger, published by Yale University Press. He had previously tutored in the Department of Art History and Complementary Studies at the RCA. His colleague, the painter John Golding, trained at the Courtauld, was an art scholar and a curator, perhaps best known for his seminal text, Cubism, A History and an Analysis, 1907 to 1914. As a curator, he was known for 2 important exhibitions mounted at the Tate Gallery: Picasso, Sculptor-Painter in 1994, and Matisse Picasso in 2002-3, which went on to the Museum of Modern Art in New York. Both men inspired me and led me to seek out other artists' writings, such as The New Art, The New Life, the collected writings of Pierre Mondrian, The Eye's Mind, Bridget Riley, collected writings, Patrick Heron on Art and Education, and The Daily Practice of Painting, Writings and Interviews, 62 to 93 by Gerhard Richter. These and other texts gave and continue to give me insight and context. I'm currently Associate Professor on the Postgraduate and PhD program at the Slade School of Fine Art, UCL, where I've taught part-time for over 20 years. My colleagues and I teach via tutorials and critiques that reflect our own art educations, knowledge of art history and contemporary art, with varying levels of critical and theoretical allegiance. Our MA students receive a taught history and theory of art component, while the MFA students complete written and oral critical studies supported by their personal studio tutors. UCL has a distinguished history of art department separate from the Slade, various museums and collections including the UCL Art Museum. We have the British Museum, the National Gallery, the National Portrait Gallery, the British Library, Courtauld, both Tates, Britain and Modern, and the Wallace Collection close by. Commercial galleries and artist-run spaces are spread across London, and it would be impossible to walk to the Slade from anywhere without encountering art firsthand. Nevertheless, the value of this can dissolve when a quick Google search puts an image to a name. Since 2014, I've directed the Discourse Project, developed in tandem with the Materials Research Project at the Slade. The aim is to research the cultural, social, and philosophical issues that inform, shape, and define the experience of contemporary painting. Since inception, 5 artists have acted as honorary research associates within the Discourse Project, investigating personal research strands which are shared with students via talks, seminars, and visits. Just as a very nice plug, one of those honorary research associates, Rose Davey, is here, and her research has been captured in this pamphlet that she produced, which are an artist's response to, in form of a guide, to 6 paintings in the National Gallery. Rose has a few more of them here that she might share or sell. But it's quite a unique thing for a young artist to wish to convey something of their engage in front of works of art as a maker in relation to the art history. We're also currently with the two HRAs developing a prototype mobile display unit, allowing artists to curate and interpret existing UCL museums. In this mobile display unit, it's called a knowledge exchange mobile display unit, because that's the way it got funded, to act as a pop-up show space involving audience participation. In his Walter Neurath Memorial Lecture from 2000, published as Experience and Interpretation, The Dilemma of Museums of Modern Art, Nicholas Sirota talks about how we see art and how it is displayed. He addresses the changing attitudes, the way art is presented, and outlines that any display must consider an active dialogue between the present and the past. He references the voracious consumption of culture by a wider public than ever before, and gives a coherent historical account of the changing attitudes to the way art is presented in a modern museum of art. Almost 2 decades on from this insightful essay, how in the age of the internet has the debate shifted? A study done by the Metropolitan Museum of New York a year ago found the average time taken by a visitor in front of a work of art is 28 seconds. I was quite impressed by that. John Ruskin wrote about spending the entire morning in a church looking at its art and architecture. I might not be arguing for that. The term slow art seems to have new currency. Professor Arden Reed's book, Slow Art, The Experience of Looking, Sacred Images to James Turrell, University of California Press, is about attending to visual images in a culture of distraction. And Slow Looking, the art and practice of learning through observation by Shari Tishman, tackles this from a maker's perspective. Matthew Gale, curator of the current Pierre Bonnard, The Colour of Memory at Tate Modern, has incorporated slow looking events. Slow Art Day 2019 is on April the 6th and is across 84 venues around the world, including Tate Modern and the Photographers Gallery in London. The 48-year-old American artist Corrie Newark recently said, "I was born analog, but I will die digital, and my experience is both." Can we be born digital, die analog, and experience both? Philip Guston said, "Painting and sculpture are very archaic forms. It's the only thing left in our industrial, and I would add technological society, where an individual alone can make something which is not just his own hands, but brains, imagination, heart, maybe." In 2001, I stated my own ambitions as a painter to be, I want to make paintings that root you to the spot, albeit for a split second, while peeling the cornea from your eyes, cleansing, washing, refreshing them. Perhaps then, how we now look at painting might re-acknowledge and continue the power of direct engagement. Thank you.
Thank you, Estelle. I realised in my haste and excitement of talking about curators and artists that I didn't properly introduce Kathleen Soriano. And although most of you met her being guided around the show that she's just curated here, I've known Kathleen for quite a long time, and most of all at the Royal Academy, where she was our head of exhibitions and put on some fantastic shows there, and since then has gone on to become a TV star and a curator of other great shows. So thank you very much, and apologies for not saying this earlier.
So let's see if I can get this mic somewhere. Oh, that's better, isn't it? Okay. So my title, which Stephen wouldn't tell you what it was, I'll tell you what it is a quote from Benjamin Franklin. "Tell me, and I forget. teach me and I remember, involve me and I learn. So I'm going to sort of talk a little bit around mainly art in education, I think, which is what I'm all about. Even though I started, I was quite lucky in some ways because they offered art at my school as an A-level. But at that point, because the focus had narrowed down so much in our studying, I was a bit nervous about taking art history because I didn't really know anything about it. And it seemed like this odd, strange class that only about 3 or 4 of the girls actually took. So I put it to one side because it was too risky. I needed a strong, stable subject. But then I was lucky enough to get an English-speaking union scholarship to the States, and I studied in Kentucky for a year at a university there. And of course, the American system, where you have a whole load of classes that you can take, really opened up whole new worlds to me. The study of thanatology, for example, sociology. But the one that sort of really inspired me and set me on my career path was that I did art history. And in Louisville, Kentucky, we had the fantastic Speed Art Museum, where I really encountered art for the very first time. I think coming from an immigrant family that was all about a work ethic, our weekends were not spent by being taken to museums and galleries where we were educated about the higher, finer things in life. So being exposed to that work in the Speed Art Gallery sort of firsthand really sort of blew me away, mainly, I think, with the skill of production. That's what I couldn't understand. I couldn't understand how Boccioni could make those forms. And that's what sort of really captured me. But at that point, I wasn't thinking about becoming a curator. But then I did come back and I went to university and I decided to do history of art, but I was still sort of hedging my bets, and I did a combined arts degree and put a bit of English in with it as well, because I thought just in case, I can cover myself. So I started my museum career, and in 2006 I found myself as director at Compton Verney. And at that time, one of the things that we used to talk about in the art world is how can we make art relevant to people's lives today? At Compton Verney we tried to look at all the eclectic collections. We had a Chinese bronze collection, we had Neapolitan Baroque, we had a little bit of English portraiture, and I was trying to bring them together by finding themes that were relevant to our lives today that were cut across all of them. So it might have been religion, or it might have been war, because I felt it was really important to give people a sense of why something like this related to our lives today, because then it would have a meaning for them and it would have an understanding. And I think once you have an understanding of what a painting, what the story the painting is telling, or what the story is that the artist is trying to tell you, that helps you to appreciate it much more. But it's no longer relevance that we talk about in museums and galleries now. We've moved on to a new word, and that word is useful. Art can't just be relevant anymore, it's got to be useful. And there's even a term that's been used in some museums today called arte utile, which is about useful art. And that is largely associated with social impact. And the new phrase that's been bandied around is well-being. So well-being in art, you can actually get art on prescription today. No, don't laugh, this is deadly serious. And it does worry me slightly because I have over the years watched libraries go through this attempt to bring meaning to what they actually do. Their value to their social communities, the fact that homeless people can go there and pick up coats. And I do worry slightly that museums and galleries are desperately trying to find meaning beyond the truth and beauty of what's actually on their walls. But I mention those sorts of phrases and those words because I think it's very much about the instrumentalizing of art. We had to learn how to speak in government terms in the 1980s and 1990s because that was the only way in which museums and galleries were going to get the money from government and from the funders in order to support what we really wanted to do. And a lot of this goes back to Chris Smith's time. And Chris Smith was an incredibly important figure at that time because he spoke about the value of the creative industries. It wasn't just the art world or museums and galleries. He brought us all together, the theatre, the music industry. And as a result, we had a much sort of richer and stronger power that could be measured, really. But we never really argued for truth and beauty. That was never the way in which we sort of protected what we believed in. And I always sort of asked myself, why? Was it a backlash against class, a backlash against elitism or perceived connoisseurship? But, you know, it's still undermining, always undermining the aesthetic value in art when we try and instrumentalise it in some way. But you have to remember that even the great Victorian philanthropists, yes, it was very sort of patrician, they would provide art for the enjoyment of their workers, such as the Lady Lever up in Port Sunlight, for example. And the art was there to be spiritual, to be elevating. But I do think with all of this instrumentalisation, we have actually lost something, and we constantly apologise for truth and beauty, for elegance, for the aesthetic, for the emotional impact, and for the skill that's involved. And I do think that the class ceiling is very much an issue. At the moment, only wealthy people can afford to send their children to extracurricular arts activities. And I think it's incredibly ironic that at a time when government is removing arts from the curriculum, we are being told that the only skills that we need in future are creative ones, collaborative problem solving, because robots will do everything else. And this disconnect is not there for everybody, because the business world gets it, property developers get it. They've been using artists and the likes of Hackney to help them with gentrification and then increase the value of their properties for years. And there are a number of artists I know at the moment who are living in Nottingham because they get very cheap housing. There's a great community of artists up there, a lot of them working at the university, and most of them have said to me, don't tell anybody, because, you know, they're being able to be creative in a way that works for them. And then we also know about the Bilbao effect, for example. We've had the V&A just open in Dundee, we've had Abu Dhabi. So someone gets it, someone gets the art and sort of profitability work together. So we need to fix this disconnect, really, because I think it's really important that we're exposed to art early in our life and we understand the clear benefit of it in our later life. I don't really understand why it's still a soft subject. You know, is it because of its past elite associations, or because the value, whether it's good or bad, is subjective? Or is it because that value is often ascribed by people who are assumed to be the elite or the few in terms of curators, as you suggested? Or is it because we're not very good at expressing its value? I've been fascinated by the fact that in the 1980s or so, they started offering science communication grants at communication degrees at university. Scientists realized they had a problem communicating, that what they were trying to communicate was complicated. So what did they do? They set up a degree to make it easier to communicate about it. And I wonder whether arts and humanities needs a similar sort of report. I mean, yes, we've had universities like the LSE produce quantitative reports about our contribution to GDP, etc., over the years, but it's still not getting the message across. And I think one of the issues is, are we talking about ourselves as the arts, as purely the arts, or are we prepared to be part of the creative industry? And I think despite all of his positioning around that in the 80s and 90s, we still fight against being part of the entire creative industries. We're not good at working together. But there have been lots of small victories about bringing things together in a way. I heard recently that the NYPD, the New York Police Force, have been taking lessons with the curators at the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York about looking. And crime solving has increased, it's gone up, because they're learning to look longer and harder. And there's a new sort of offer being put together by the wonderful Art UK called The Superpower of Looking, and it's for 7 to 11-year-olds, and it's helping them understand about how this long looking, learning and understanding is very important. And we've seen surgeons, for example, going back to arts classes because, you know, needing to learn about taking things slowly and paying attention to detail in these times, as you mentioned, Estelle, of skim reading and swiping. And the other problem is, of course, it's hard to produce qualitative measures. Einstein, a scientist, said, not everything that counts can be measured, not everything that not everything that can be measured counts. But we're more visually literate than ever. You know, we have Instagram, for example, as Estelle mentioned. I remember when the iPods with the music first arrived, that was the very moment when I realized that everybody was curating. They were curating their music onto their iPod. But now we curate our lives into pictures that mirror our desired lives. It's not necessarily the real one. So there's beauty, but not always truth that we put together on our Instagram accounts. In New Zealand, the Prime Minister, Jacinda Ardern, instructed her Treasury recently to include cultural well-being as a core component of new living standards framework. And she passed a bill that ensures that council deliver social, economic, environmental and cultural impact for all communities. And I think we're quite lucky at the moment, in some ways, that Matt Hancock has been the Cultural Secretary, and he's now working as the National Health Secretary for Health, and he has an understanding of the value of art in that broader context. Communities are also far more important, and quite rightly so. I have a number of friends who work in the art world who are complaining a lot about institutional racism in the arts funding system, and there's also the post-colonial impact on the story of the history of art. We all like those straight lines that join Impressionism to post-Impressionism and everything else, but it's not a straight line anymore. It's a world art history rather than a Western view. I read this morning coming in on the train that LA County Museum has just amalgamated its European art and its American art departments, and the article was scandalized at the prospect of this, but it made complete sense to me. They're both coming out of the same traditions. Why shouldn't they sit side by side? It's important, I think, that the art and cultural activities that we are exposed to actually reflects our communities for all of us. It took me a long time to appreciate the fact that young black kids were coming into the portrait gallery when I worked there for 18 years and not seeing any people that looked like them on the walls. And that sounds like a throwaway comment, but it isn't. It's an important thing. And I think Arts Council has recognised this recently. They've shifted their emphasis onto creativity for everybody. It's not just about diverse communities, it's about everybody. It's the white, lower class, working class male as well. And that smacks slightly of being anti-elite, slightly hobbyist, but it's about everyone getting involved in the making of art in that way that sort of Benjamin Franklin himself was alluding to. Tristram Hunt, the director of the V&A, spoke about this in his Case for Creativity in July 2018, how the fact that there is extraordinary happiness and satisfaction designing and creating, it's a fundamental human desire, he said. It's a building block for essential life skills such as resilience, confidence, self-expression and motivation, and a powerful tool for social change. So just that little bit of instrumentality is still there. And the Cultural Learning Alliance repeated that learning through arts and culture can increase cognitive abilities and improve attainment in other subjects such as maths and English. And a US study showed that the arts foster scientific success. The more accomplished a scientist, the more likely they are to have a creative hobby. I've never met a scientist who isn't obsessed with visual depictions of his equation or his perfect graph. And it's as if they're always searching for the visualization, that aesthetic representation, sort of truth and beauty. And the Innovation Fund, Nesta, supports the studio schools movement, where schools are linked with the idea of workplaces. The beginning of education is actually therefore connected to what we have to do in adult life. And there's increasing evidence that a combination of practical and academic education, a meeting of traditional subjects, and a focus on problem solving and creativity is what we need to give children the skills to succeed in a high-tech economy. Now, the barriers that exist, apart from the fact that the government is taking arts out of the curriculum altogether, is that the recent reforms actually make it hard to study science and the arts together. Now, the Nesta 2015 report suggests that the UK needs to make 1 million new creative jobs by 2030. And the creative economy is one of the UK's great success stories. It accounts for 2.6 million jobs. That's bigger than advanced manufacturing, bigger than financial services, that's banking, and it's bigger than construction. And the creative sector in the UK is growing jobs at 4 times the rate at the rest of the economy. 1 in 11 jobs in the UK are in the creative economy, and there are already recognised skill gaps. So why aren't we investing in it? I don't understand. In the US in 2015, the creative industries contributed $763 billion to the economy. That's more than agriculture or transportation. And the sector there also expanded faster than the overall economy. And 7% of the jobs in New York City are in the arts. Now, the Nesta report also showed that those people who work in the creative arts tend to have a much higher than average life satisfaction. That's clearly not because of what they're paid, though, I would suggest. And then in late February, Andreas Schleicher, who leads the Programme for the International Student Assessment for the OECD, told the House of Commons Education Select Committee, who were looking at the idea of the fourth revolution, that young people benefit more from skills gained through creativity rather than test-based learnings, suggesting that it will become more important than maths, which becomes a softer skill as robots take over. And the hard skills will be curiosity, leadership, persistence, and resilience. Now, he says that British schools largely regard skills as inferior to knowledge. British schools associate learning with the past. It's easy to teach, it's easy to test. But, he says, the modern world doesn't reward you for what you know, but for what you can do with what you know. Now, museums and galleries in the UK are at risk because of funding issues primarily, but there are deeper issues that sit beneath it that are related to communities, to class, race, purpose, and function in these rapidly changing times. There are collections that are currently being sold off. There are curators being sacked. Only this last week we've heard that Leicester museums have got rid of all their curators. And there are arts venues merging around the country. Salisbury is putting its arts centre and its theatre together. The Arnolfini has already merged with the university. So, you know, there are good positive things that are coming from out of that, but at the same time, there are alarm bells. I think it comes back really to the issue of ascribed value, and unless we embed art and art history and creative subjects at school, we'll perpetuate the class divide that's associated with art and art appreciation, I think, and I do think that's at the heart of its problems in some way. And we'll fail to build a creative population that can take on AI and the robots. And we'll continue to have to find instrumental reasons like usefulness or well-being or relevance, which will come round again. Believe me, it will come round again, it always does. We'll have to find those reasons to maintain culture and to allow truth and beauty to survive. Thank you.
I'm wondering if does this work? It does. Hang on. Hang on. Do a bit of bending. Hello. Yes. Thank you very much, Kathleen. Now, I feel duty-bound as ringmaster to bring us back in the first assault on opening this dialogue to art history. As I think, you know, we've talked a lot about the practice of the artist and their relationship with freedom and creativity. But I think that if Martin Kemp were here, and I can almost be Martin Kemp for a minute, in his absence, without, I think, destroying his reputation. If Martin were here, I know that one of his priorities when he was appointed as the Professor of Art History to the University of Oxford, following on from Francis Haskell, who had for decades before been the head of the department, was to start an undergraduate course in art history. So Oxford University had brilliant faculty of history. It had an art school, didn't have a school of architecture, and it didn't have an undergraduate course in art history. And I was on the appointments committee for Martin's appointment to his chair, and I remember him very clearly saying at his interview that his sole intention, apart from maintaining the quality of delivery of art history in the university, was to start an undergraduate course. And I could see the history faculty backing out of the room as this was said, because in Oxford at that time, art history wasn't considered a serious subject. History was. And art was insofar as informed history, but art history wasn't a university subject. Anyhow, bless him, Martin managed to start an art history course within a relatively few, I think probably within 5 years, which is high speed in Oxford. And that was his first idea, and it's there running now. But another very important issue that he raised in his interview, and I'm not sure how this unfolded in the end, but he said that we should drop the idea of art history, and that he liked the idea of a department of visual culture, or the study of visual culture. And I've thought about this very often since first hearing him say this. And I can see a lot of sense in it, in that if you look at the shape of art in galleries today, it isn't a bunch of people making engravings, working with oil paint on canvas, and doing stuff that is traditionally associated with a subject called fine art. It's new stuff. People, if you go to the Royal Academy today, you will see an exhibition where Bill Viola and Michelangelo are doing a two-man show. Michelangelo is showing drawings, courtesy of the Royal Collection here in England, and Bill Viola is showing big video pieces, and the exhibition attempts to draw together these two very different streams, as they were, of our visual culture, film and silver point drawing. And
Who comes off best?
It's not for me to say here.
Really?
No. You can say. It does strike me that there is a very strong argument that if a study of art history, let's call it to be less certain about what that subject is, whether it, is it just about art, or could it be about craft, could it be about design, could it be about cinematography and cinematography's relationship with the novel, and so on, that the idea of having departments that have a broad reach rather than a corner that they have to defend might be the way forward in terms of arguing for a bigger future for art history rather than looking back to its historically quite small position. I mean, I don't know what the panel think about that. And it would be, say, drop art history, call it visual culture.
What do I have to press? Oh, there. I'd keep art history, but I'd be very happy with it sitting underneath a banner that was called visual culture that would then draw in lots of other things at the same time. But I think there's a specificity to art history that needs to be part of telling that story in a very particular way. But I think it would be comfortable sitting in amongst other subjects that were looking at things in that way, personally.
What do you think, Estelle?
Well, I don't mind what the terminology really is. I think already, and for a long period of time, art history has been significant to young artists and within art education, but also the breadth of that art history is enormous. It really is global. It can take on any form. In our day-to-day conversations in the studio, we might be talking about writing, writers, filmmakers, dance, fashion, graphics, or we might be talking about some of the paintings that are surrounding us here today. It is really that diverse. It is impossible to imagine a linear art history being taught within any institution. I don't see that it would have any value. But it has a place, and it's a very significant and important place. And my point is that when you have students directly engage with art from the past, usually within museums, there is something very, very significant that happens, because that experience, without the mediation of a screen, with contextual text, with explanations, with, as was probably a big surprise to me today, that the Dulwich Picture Gallery was purpose-built all of that time ago in relation to experience and engage with looking at something made by a human hand. So it's sort of like, I don't know, that art history is significant and important, but I'm as up-to-date as the next man and believe that the breadth of what both, not just for makers, I'm not just going to defend it as a maker or as a teacher, but also for audiences too. The world is just, it does slide and morph and needs to.
Daphne, do you think, Daphne, as a portrait painter, do you think a good student needs to be aware of the history of portrait painting in order to be a good portrait painter?
I think it helps. I think, to me, a lot of the talk this afternoon has been academics talking to academics. The idea that the poor can't access art seems to be a nonsense. Now, if you have to have a gallery to show your work, fair enough, but you actually only need a few railings. And actually, all you need... I painted an eminent scientist at the Science Museum. I've forgotten his name, I'm afraid, my age. But he was amazed that I turned up with an easel, a wooden easel, and a jam jar with my Terps in it, an old jam jar. And I said, well, we are still painting in the same way. And I'm all for everybody using all sorts of media, but you don't have to throw the baby out with the bathwater. So there are still exhibitions going on. Yes, lots of galleries have loads of other things going on in them, but lots have, down Cork Street in particular, still have paintings on the walls, and contemporary paintings. And lots of people are still commissioning portraits. It may be that they will commission, like St. Paul's. I have a portrait in St. Paul's. Bill Viola has his works in St. Paul's. There's room for everybody. My earlier little few words was about saying that looking at something is actually, and taking the time, which I think Estelle picked up on, taking time to look at something is actually a beneficial thing to you, whatever branch of art you go on into. And looking at the artworks, what I don't like is everybody going around galleries with something plugged to their heads. Now, fine if you come back to that, fine if you look at the catalogue when you get home, all of those things. But that communication is meant to be from the painting. I've been gazing at that painting by Van Dyck of a dead lady at the top there because I painted my dead mother. And clearly he's been more tasteful and tried to keep her still alive. And, I've been thinking of the way that it drifts off into the shadow, which suggests the drifting off into death. And I was looking at the faces of the audience and saying, what are they looking at? Now, largely, fortunately, because we had good speakers, they were looking at the speaker. Hardly anybody was ever looking, even incidentally, at what was round the walls. And it's that I think you have to expose students to real art from all the ages. Actually, they tended to be kept from it. A nephew of mine went to Leeds Art College. He wasn't allowed to do any sort of practical art for the first 2 terms. And then he happened to be the only person who chose to paint, and other people did other things. He thought what he did, he got a first, but he did it with a tongue in cheek and said, I know what they want. I'm going to make some piles of this and that and the other. And he got a first and went out and he makes a nice living making promotional videos. I think he uses visual art that way. But very, very few people, it's almost as though, in fact, I detect it here a little bit, that if you are the practitioner choosing to do what I do, that's a lesser thing to be doing than something that's considered more contemporary?
I don't think that was... I'd like to go back to something you just said, the example of your nephew, relative. John Ruskin, I can't tell you exactly where it is, but he did at one point write that societies get the art they deserve. And that's pretty much a good illustration of that, is that you're not, in theory, going to get a show in the Tate Gallery if you paint portraits today.
No, you're not.
Unless you're David, yeah. And the question is he painting portraits or is he painting pictures? And
But are you painting to get a career and use which a lot of it, or are you just painting because you want to paint?
Of young contemporary artists for whom portraiture in one form or another, often painted, actually. I can name quite a lot. Yeah, from this side of the Atlantic and the other, and actually globally. So it really is a misnomer to imagine that somehow painting portraiture has died. It has not died.
I also think that painting is huge with the young at the minute. I'm making an exhibition at the moment for Manchester on contemporary painting because young people are really enjoying painting again, and the materiality of it, and figurative painting as well. It's moving away from the abstraction.
It's simply never gone away. No. Like anything in the world, there are moments where things trend, and there are moments where they get institutional support or they get public interest or approval. But really, at any given time, I would say, since, cave painting, painting has existed and has been enjoyed at some level with varying levels of support and interest. But it's never gone away. It's never died. I wasn't going to have I wasn't going to propose something that even gave credence to that term, because it just doesn't exist. Painting is relevant today as it ever has been. What concerns me is...
You heard it here.
is that we make sure that a generation for whom the magic of painting still inspires them constantly, both in looking at it and making, does not get occasionally tripped up by the screen, that they continue to enjoy the truth and beauty of direct encounter. I've just been fortunate enough to be somewhere very beautiful, which has a beach called Paradise. And in Paradise, which is paradise, so many people arrived with their cameras, I can't tell you. And like all of us do, tried to capture, the beauty. And I'm not saying it wasn't experienced firsthand. Of course it was. But that little moment can get in the way.
But it is also the truth of today, because that is the way...
Absolutely.
It is the way people look now, is through that lens. And I think it was really interesting, Daphne, what you were saying about the subtleties of what you actually see in the moment as opposed to what you see after. And I thought that was absolutely fascinating. But for many people, I remember, this was probably back in the early thousands, I was in China going through a museum, and there were a lot of young Chinese women photographing these Western Impressionist paintings. And I was huffing and puffing, because they weren't looking at them. And I stopped one of them and I asked her why she was doing it. And through the interpreter, she explained that she would take those photographs home, she would upload them onto her computer, and then she would sit with her parents or with her friends, and they would study the pictures. And I asked her, how long would you spend on each painting? She said 20 minutes. She was looking at that picture for longer than I was, really, but I was being very prejudiced about the way in which she was doing it. And I think that one of the things is that we have to remember is that people access art in very different ways. I mean, you spoke about the virtual absorption of exhibitions online, particularly contemporary. That does happen. And the thing about the headset, I used to be very prejudiced about people walking around with headsets and why they weren't just looking. But when I made the exhibition, the bronze exhibition at the Royal Academy, what I realized is that people find different ways of finding their way into something. And some people want to understand how it's made. Other people want to know what it means. Other people want to know the biography of the artist. And people absorb that information, in the same way as my Benjamin Franklin quote, in different ways. Some people want to look, some people want to hear, some people want to feel it. So, a museum curator's job is to provide all of that interpretation in as many different forms as possible. So I have come to accept that there is a role for film that shows you how the lost wax techniques works, or someone's voice sitting in your ear, taking you by your hand through the paintings in the collection, even though I don't like them. But it's about providing, we're very lucky because of our education and our careers. We are literate. We don't see the barriers that other people see. Because I work in telly like you do, I was talking to my makeup artist and I said how I can't walk into a Sephora shop in New York which only sells makeup because I go in completely overwhelmed by all these lipsticks. I only need one. What are all these colours? And I walk straight out. And she turned to me without batting an eyelid and she said, that's exactly the way I feel when I walk into a museum. Mm. And that's what we have to remember. We know how to read. We know what the language is.
But would this be an argument for teaching a larger group of students who go through universities the history of art?
I would say yes, and I'm surprised actually that Estelle's talking about the students at the Slade. Maybe you're unique in looking at art history because a lot of the art students that I've come across, or even talking to people like one of the professors at Yale a couple of years ago, they were saying that the students aren't interested in anything that's earlier than Picasso. They're just not looking at it. And a lot of the art schools aren't. So I think you're quite unique in that way at Slade.
Possibly and probably. And it is part of just what is graduate painting that I would say specifically has enjoyed using that direct approach of taking people into galleries and talking about work in front of it. Of course, not everywhere has that opportunity. I think museums are doing a great job, actually, and have been for a long time at trying to integrate from really early on. For years, I got very upset about walking around the National Gallery and tripping over school groups that were endlessly, grouped around a painting. I'm joking, but, like a little bit of me as an artist was like, hold on a minute, guys, I actually want to get towards the stuff myself. I think it's amazing. I think the virtual tours that the National Gallery does are brilliant. I think I was even curious to find out in getting ready for this that they have an app and then you can share, on there. I think it's called something like I can't remember, a clever app or something, or a savvy app or something. I can't remember. But anyway, I think that is amazing. I want the dissemination of art. I want everyone to be turning on a screen and learning something about art, to inspire them to then go and look at whatever they're looking at, to see it in the flesh, to know how big it is, to understand how it's painted. I mean, Jennifer did an amazing talk just with the Rembrandt, didn't she, about she pulled us in and reminded us of all that was in that image, which was about looking, about experiencing, about seeing, about the direct tactile engage of looking.
She made us see the highlight on the nose. And that highlight must have been in Rembrandt's mind from the beginning of the painting, or he would have used up all his whites in the sleeve of the girl without leaving enough to say that something even lighter than that. So right from the start, and this is why you really need, if you're going to paint at all, especially from observation, but if you're going to paint at all, you need over-the-shoulder teaching. So that if the students are all looking at a particular subject, whether it's a still life or otherwise, the teacher has to sit down where they're sitting or stand where they're standing at their easel and see what they're seeing and say, well, at the moment, when I'm standing here, I see this. You have not painted or drawn that. Why not? Not that they're wrong, but why not? Because everything's changing, even if it's just the artist's own head or the fact he's using one eye compared to another, the fact that you've got motion parallax, all of those things that make it so complicated to know what it is you're trying to put down on your canvas, you have to have somebody with an eye, with experience, to sit in that position and open up the world of possibilities with how you are looking and what you're choosing to make your artwork with. And I think it's that sounds to me, I'm not saying it's completely gone from the slate, it's gone from a lot of colleges.
I think from the majority of colleges.
That's what I've heard.
In that, about 1950, it was possible to go to an art school and you would be taught strategies for achieving end results in landscape painting or figure painting or in modern art.
Yes, I'm not talking about giving them a strategy particularly, but more that they see that they have not seen enough. You know, that they say, well, it looked to be there when I was
you
studying it.
elegantly described why that highlight on the nose is possible. And it is because he hadn't used up all his whites in the middle of the painting, and there is nothing brighter than white. So you have to have a strategy which holds back pure white to the last moment, and that's your finale.
If you're doing anything shiny, yes.
Yeah, and it's so obvious when one says it, but it's something that is painfully difficult to learn through practice without guidance.
Yes.
I think you could spend your whole life
That's what I'm saying.
using up your whites
Yes.
too early.
Yes.
But
And people go on doing it.
I want to ask you're patiently sitting there. Would you like to sort of pull us in another direction before we throw this open to a broader range of questions?
Well, as you know, I'm not an artist. I'm not an art historian. I'm a Shakespearean, theatre person, and it seems to me that this conference has followed on from the last conference, which was actually to do with literature. And we had eminent speakers, including Terry Eagleton and Emma Smith and Catherine Temple, who's sitting over there, talking to us. And one thing that kept coming out was this aspect of truth and the relevance of truth within literature and within art. And what's happened today, again, is truth is coming out. This word keeps coming through in all the discussions that are going on. And yet we're living in a world in which we've got being economical with the truth, fake truth, false truth. My truth is better than your truth. My truth is that of the President of the United States, so it must be the truth of the world. Or my truth is my truth about Brexit. My truth is my truth about what we said about Brexit on the one side. My truth is my truth about what we said about Brexit on the one side. That truth itself is a subject which we're being hit with, and the falsity of truth is a subject which we're being hit with all the time. And yet what we're saying is what's coming out of art, what's coming out of literature is a truth. What is that truth? What is that truth that's coming out? I was giving a talk in St Hugh's in Oxford just a couple of weeks ago, when to some Russian students, and it came to questions. One student said to me, she said, "I've got a question. To be or not to be?" See? To be or not to be? So I said, well, that is quite an important question. Because not to be is just emptiness. To be is something which is true. You are. What happens when you're not, we don't know. And Shakespeare is confronting that truth all the way through the play. He's confronting truth. truth about our own humanity, about who we are, who we're not, who we pretend to be, the illusions that we try to create, and the power we try to have over other people to convince them of our particular truth. But in the end, there is only one truth. You are, or you're not. And I've been looking at the paintings as we've been going on, particularly the bottom here, you know, with the strategically placed hand, you know, working out, well, did he decide to get that hand there right from the beginning? I don't know. I don't know. I thought when you said about the white, and I'm sure you know your practitioners, but there's that great thing about Turner coming on and putting the little red and winning the competition by painting the boy. So I think sometimes, and certainly as a writer, and I've written a number of books, certainly as a writer you feel that you know what you're writing, and yet towards the end there are things you want to go back to and just touch up, just make it just that little bit better. Sometimes you make it worse by doing it, you know. But I don't have the problem in writing of running out of ink. But you have, obviously, it does with whites, as you both agree. So I don't know if that's taking you on any further, Stephen, or whether that's just giving you a headache. But I think it's to do with truth. It's truth. Have you got a headache? Stephen, have you got a headache or not?
Not yet.
No.
Not yet. I'm resilient. No, but it touches on an important point that I think all of you have made, which is it's something to do with having time to look and time to reflect. And although there is a whole zone through which information now comes where you're not expected to think or reflect, it just lands, and you say to the person next to you, "Do you know what X has done now?" And and that's as far as it goes. It doesn't necessarily open a dialogue, but I think that life drawing, painting a portrait, looking at a painting, as opposed to looking at a painting on a screen, takes time. And I think that one of the things that may be missing from our bigger plans in education at the moment is giving our students time to reflect, to think, and to practice. And certainly for me, that's just about all I did in my postgraduate studies, was sit and look at stuff and open and enter into dialogues with people who knew about that stuff. And I think it is very difficult to walk into an art gallery cold and make sense of what is on the wall. I think it's very difficult to take hold of an artist, Murillo. Can I just finish? Sorry. Take hold of an artist like Murillo, and if you don't know anything about them, begin to unwrap what is going on. And it's why I would advocate, if you're going to study art history, why not start with a survey course that attempts to join up the dots, so that at least there is a framework into which you can place Bill Viola, Michelangelo, and because it's got to be that the fun of the game of art history is joining up the dots between. Is how does Peter Doig relate to Vermeer, if at all? Or perhaps more interestingly, how does Piero della Francesca relate to Jackson Pollock? He does. I disagree.
Stephen, I remember talking to Bridget Riley about, she was going to do some work, we'll come back to you, we're going to do some work with her at the university, and she'd just done the Mondrian exhibition at the Taste. Now, if you ever saw that, but it's a terrific exhibition. And I talked to her about it, and I said, is Mondrian, one of the greatest influences on your art? And she said, well, it's an influence, but not the greatest influence. I said, well, who's that? She said, well, Rembrandt, of course.
Yeah.
Rembrandt, of course. And I realized as a kind of amateur that I didn't understand that when I look at a self-portrait of Rembrandt, or when I look at the girl in the window, if it is a window, that I'm looking from a position of drama, and I'm looking at the character that's coming through, but she's looking at actually the way that the light is working, which I haven't been trained to do. Now, I think I like to be trained to do that, so I come and listen to people like yourselves to hear about that. But similarly, I've got my training. If you're going to look at modern literature, how can most modern literature in English, how can you look at it if you don't know about Shakespeare? Because it's going through. But if you look at Shakespeare, how can you really start to understand Shakespeare if you don't know anything about the liturgy of the church, a liturgical drama, and the traditions of medieval drama that have led in to Shakespeare? So there is a continuity. But of course, in my subject, that was all attacked on the canon of literature, of English literature and so on and so forth. But there is a continuity and a cross-referencing that is going on. Certainly in my subject, I'm sure it is going on absolutely within art and art history.
I mean, there is art history as a study of the history of art. There are also artists' histories where artists write their histories and engage you through their histories. There is also the art historical exchange between artists where, the canon or whatever, one artist going to look at another artist, Bridget looking at Rembrandt, as well as a whole plethora of other artists. We all do that all the time. Interpretation is really significant, but as far as I'm concerned, there is a value to interpretation for either the maker or the audience, and in the same way, there is, beyond interpretation, there is the practical, the learnt history of using stuff, and there is also just the sort of miasma, the plethora of where knowledge, intuition, tactile ability, visual cognition, all come together. Yeah. And that's when artworks really, move us, and that's when art becomes significant, whether it's through partly learning something of a history or simply stumbling across. I still believe, there's a lovely story of Peter Stuyvesant had a collection in his factory, and he decided to collect abstract paintings in the 50s. And he put those paintings on the walls of his factory floor, and everyone said, this is rubbish, my child could do this, what is this? 6 months later, for whatever reason, he decided he was going to move that collection out of the factory floor. There was uproar. Everyone working there, that's our paintings. Why on earth are you moving them? They're ours, leave them, we enjoyed them. Don't know why that story seemed relevant, but, something to do with knowledge and experience.
Yeah. Okay. Stephen, there was a gentleman there who was wanting to ask a question.
I think we should start with some questions, and there's a microphone coming your way. So,
I think they're recording it. That's why they want to capture it. It's not to do with your abilities to project.
We've seen today some wonderful examples of people who can put over ideas with a clarity and enthusiasm that is inspirational. We have seen others. The problem, or one of the problems you're facing, is that the teaching of the subjects that we're considering, or the subjects we're considering, is not good. It's not good at primary school. It's not good at secondary school, which I was a governor for 14 years. And it's certainly not good at university. It's rubbish at some universities, and one of those universities is Oxford. My own son and 20 of his other people. You know a lot, but you can't teach it. And the sooner this group learn that the people who can teach don't necessarily have to be able to do, the better. That's my sort of thought you might like to discuss.
Well, in response to that, I feel I must say, strangely, a conversation at lunchtime, I feel that at the best institutions, that adage that if you can't do, teach, is absolutely wrong. That the best artists can make amazing teachers. Art history has proven that fact. And there is some huge relevance to being taught by a practitioner, because the practitioner, if they're good, is able to give insight that no other can, because direct learnt experience in that way is invaluable. And so, for sure, I agree with the comments that were made earlier about the fact that there isn't enough being put into the arts and humanities. It is, as a curriculum subject, being ignored and undervalued. But at the same time, where it is taught, it's taught, of course, like anything, at different levels, varying degrees of success. But there are still amazing artists who teach. There are amazing academics who engage young minds with new ideas. And there are amazing young artists and art historians and cultural theorists emerging to build the cultural possibility. So I'm not so, full of doom. I think there are things happening with museums that keep us apace of changes in society. I think we're in a really fabulous place, but that we need always just a little bit more.
Can I just come back on that question about teaching in the various universities? My career, as I said earlier, started in 1974. It started at Sunderland, which is now a working class, what I'd call a working class university. I moved on to De Montfort, again, rather a working class, also a university with great ethnic diversity. And then I went to Wrexham and Glyndŵr University, which is certainly probably the most working class university in the whole of the UK. And now I've arrived at Oxford, and I'm very proud to be at Oxford because it is one of the premier universities, if not the premier university in the world. My experience has been such that people have taught in different ways. I had over 80 come to my Shakespeare courses in Sunderland. I had 35 coming to my Chaucer course in Sunderland. I've seen excellent teachers in Sunderland, in De Montfort, and in Glyndŵr, absolutely fabulous teachers. And at Oxford, I've only just arrived. I'm at Blackfriars, but the tutorial care of the staff within Blackfriars, and I'm not just talking about the religious staff, the members of the Dominican order, but the lay staff at Blackfriars is just overwhelmingly good. They are excellent, and their colleagues I'm very proud to work with. So I think there's a kind of a view that maybe Oxford doesn't teach in the same way, and it doesn't teach in the same way as we taught at Sunderland or at De Montfort or at Glyndŵr, but the way they do teach and the care that is shown to those students is immense, absolutely immense. And I'm very proud to be there. If I didn't think that, I wouldn't be there just to being at Oxford, to be quite honest. I don't have to, really, I'm retired, and I've been brought back, brought out of my box, so to speak. Sorry.
I'm just thinking, though, about a sort of a parallel, really, with curators, I suppose, in museums and galleries. And it started in about the 1990s when I was at the National Portrait Gallery, and some of the team were arguing that we needed interpretation staff within the learning team. And I never quite understood that, because the job of a curator is to communicate either through writing or through the stories that they tell you in front of the works. And if your curator isn't doing that effectively, you need to invest in training in them to help them be a better communicator about that work, to inspire the people who either come to the gallery or who they encounter. So it sort of saddens me even more, really, that we're doing exactly that. We are getting rid of curators in major institutions in this country at the moment, rather than investing in the very people who help people grow to love and understand all these marvellous works of art.
Another word in defence of Oxford. The art school in Oxford was started with money that came from Felix Slade, the same person who gave money to London University to set up a Slade professorship there and ultimately the Slade School. And he also, or his estate, also gave money to Cambridge University, where they set up an art history department with the money. And this was really to catch up with what was going on in America at the time, where universities had already taken on the problem of teaching art history and later practical art, and the academies were starting. And really, we're looking at a date around 1870. And in his inaugural lecture, John Ruskin made it quite clear that he didn't want to start an art school that competed with the Slade, which trained artists. He didn't want to start an art school that competed with the Royal College of Art, or the National Art School as it was called at that time. And what he wanted to do was encourage the undergraduates of the university, in whatever subject they were studying, to learn to draw, because he saw it as a part of literacy, and that the ability to render images in 2 dimensions was just as important as the ability to render speech in 2 dimensions, writing. And he was actually very successful in this, and his stated aim in his inaugural lecture was that he should make the future captains of industry more aware of the beauty of art and the beauty of God's work, which seems to me like a really rather smart idea. As a result, he gave a massive collection of drawings, several thousand, and prints that were to be good examples. And so there were Turners and Durers and Constables and collections of geology, lots of drawings by himself. And these were the fine examples which he turned into a curriculum. And then he gave £3,741.70 to pay a drawing master, and it was a drawing master, they said, to animate this collection with the students. And it all went on beautifully until modern art turned up. And suddenly the models were out of date. The Ashmolean, which is where it was housed, was no longer an appropriate place. The curators loathed the students. The students couldn't make a mess in there. And they moved out into another building, painted it white, and it became a modern art school. Philadelphia Academy is still going strong. Chicago Institute is still going strong, bound to a collection. And one of the great things about America, it didn't get poor. And so it kept buying modern art. And so instead of ending up as we have in Britain with a lot of collections that were frozen once the wealth of the 19th century was spent, America forged on, and places like the Corcoran in DC had great collections of abstract expressionism that students could relate to. And I think, actually the story of modern art education is wrapped up just in that guy called Felix Slade and what America did to inspire him. And still today at Oxford, the Ruskin School on, I think it's Thursdays and Wednesday evenings, runs drawing classes for the whole university. And as a result, it does something that also mirrors what happens in America, which is that a student can study other subjects, let's say, call it a liberal arts degree, but end up doing a master's degree in fine art at a later date, which personally I approve of. I think it'd be great if all people who went to art school got a general education and then they specialise later. They could become animators and filmmakers. So I think actually, funnily enough, I think that John Ruskin got it right. And I think that what happened is that it fell apart afterwards. And my entire time in Oxford, I was trying to put it back in place. Kind of worked, didn't really. Now, enough. Questions? Yes. You have the microphone.
Yeah, well, actually, as I was originally trained for the theatre, I don't know if I do need the microphone. Can you hear me at the back? Yes, but if you're recording me, surely you can hear me without the microphone, or do you need me to use the microphone? Because I think I shall probably blast the recording if I use the microphone.
No, just speak quietly.
Yeah, well, anyway, the thing is, the points I wanted to make, I must just further compliment what Dr. Scott said about Blackfriars, because Blackfriars, because there is a kind of inverted snobbery sometimes about Oxford, whereas Blackfriars, apart from all the wonderful things you correctly said about them, they also allowed anyone who wanted to, town or gown, to attend their lectures. And I was there in the mid-1980s as a mature student. I wasn't a member of Blackfriars Hall, but I was very involved with Blackfriars, with the community, and my own college. I used to attend lectures there in theology. But they'd always had this. The Dominicans have always been quite radical, I suppose, but that's the wonderful thing. There was no them and us. It was everyone could attend the lectures. So I just wanted to make, and it still is de facto, isn't it? Yeah. That I wanted to make that point clear. Anyway, the thing is that what sprang to mind when you were saying, Stephen, I think it is, yeah, that you need to have time to reflect. Well, immediately shot into my head, W.H. Davies, what is this life if full of care? We have no time to stand and stare. And admittedly, nowadays everything is at such a pace that is being demolished. But the whole thing about, you said about it's not taught properly in the schools, universities, but you need to start sooner than that. It's in the home. I was very fortunate. My parents, as a child, took me from the age of 7, 8 upwards to all sorts of art galleries and museums. And it was my initial engagement and reaction. I would then ask a question of my parents, and maybe then if there was an attendant around, they would ask if they needed to give a further thing. So it was nurtured in me early, this love of art. Because after the theatre, I then went on to do reviews of art, and it all stems from being a child. I used to, when we went abroad, we went to all these museums, and I did drawings of the various art I saw and made comments on them from the age of 8 upwards, that was. And, you know, it is that engaging early. So the home is so important. And unfortunately, with all modern media and children watching things in one room, parents on another, somewhere else. So we need to get back to nurturing art right in the home before you go to the school even. But also that you mentioned, Estelle, that about various media working, complementing together. I was really surprised you didn't mention the theatre, because theatre, like art, is a live creativity. And it is, as Daphne so really strenuously emphasised, it is that engagement, like we engage in the theatre, we engage with the art. And that is the core of it. And we cannot lose, we need to re-engage much more. But as I say, I think it needs to start in the home. I could say much, much more, but anyway, that's for now.
That's great, thank you. Yes,
just to counter that, I do agree with you, but as an artist, and I know I have many artist friends who have a similar experience, my child hated to be taken to art galleries because, of course, she was taken endlessly to art galleries. There was never a holiday that didn't include, you know, numerous pilgrimages to different art institutions. And just so you know, in terms of the theatre, it's almost the same. There is a lovely reciprocal arrangement, or it's not reciprocal, but there's an arrangement at the moment where we are given tickets to go to ENO, and students can simply book to attend. Sadly, I would say that a small percentage do. We try to encourage it hard, and if we could broaden that everywhere to ballet, to theatre, how I would be, 100% behind it. I think building the opportunity for students to encounter things. We are pushing for widening participation across art education, of course. It's not just a buzzword, it's essential. With the cost of education now, anyone coming to the Slade, whether it's a home EU student or an overseas student, they have enormous debt. And I understand that the cost of that education makes the cherry on the top impossible. It actually makes, sadly, the education itself impossible for so many.
But it's also about opportunity. I agree, it's about the home, but it's about opportunity and what opportunity looks like to those communities. And I've got a 21-year-old daughter who's at SOAS at the moment, and I think if she was sitting up here, she'd be using words like white privilege at the moment for the way in which we talk about the arts and what we have access to. And I do think that we need to think much more carefully and more broadly about, and it's more complex than just saying children should be taken to art galleries. It's much more sophisticated than that, I think. I don't have the answers, but I think we were all very lucky.
But you don't need the headsets, definitely, because if you've got them, it is a distraction. It is how your gut feeling, you can relate and interpret it as you look at it.
No, I don't think people... I took my daughter round an exhibition when she was very young, and we used to talk about the works. And then when she was about 8 or 9, we went to Tate Britain to see a pre-Raphaelite show. They had a sheet of paper. And I thought, great, she'll have something to do, keep her occupied. She hated it. You're absolutely right, because she wasn't talking to me. I wasn't engaging with her about the art that we were looking at together. And she walked up and down the galleries shouting, boring, boring, boring.
Excellent.
So, you are right in that capacity. It is about communication. But, and it is about, people talking about something to each other and looking. But I just think beneath that sits a whole raft of things about opportunity and access.
Thank you. Can we now leave that there, please? Can we stop?
Picking up on what other speakers and questioners have said, I really wanted to ask about schools. But if I could just preface this by saying, I taught for many years in the London Borough of Southwark, which we're in now, not at the schools that might be the closest to this lovely gallery, but at schools in places like Camberwell and Peckham and Bermondsey. And just to pick up on what the gentleman behind me said, our art teachers really were some of the most fantastic teachers in the school. They got amazing results. They got children who came from very difficult homes sometimes, into places like the Slade and other, very highly regarded institutions. And I think one of the reasons they were so successful was because in London, and I've been retired for a few years now, so I don't know if this is still happening, which is why I wanted to ask about it. We had really good links between the school art departments and the galleries, and I think that worked on so many levels that in the end paid off in terms of the standards that those young people achieved in both their GCSE and their A-level examinations and their progression to university. So just wondered if anybody might be able to say a quick word about that. And also possibly about artists going into schools. Is that still happening? Thank you.
It does. And I think there's an enormous appetite within schools for this to happen. And it's always the same thing that stands in the place in between the meeting. It's financial and the timetabling on the curriculum. And, they're kind of crazy things. But, of course, in the end, it's only about prioritisation, that you're spending the money somewhere, you're spending the hours somewhere, and it's deciding where the hours are spent. And, I think what it requires, if there's any point in having this conference, is for people who are responsible for creating the curriculum and the timetable, people who are ultimately the people who decide what shape a university, school or kindergarten is in, are aware of the importance of people spending time looking, people seeing art in the flesh and not receiving it all through the internet, and of meeting people who are creative people who make art. And you learn about highlights on noses, you learn about, how photography when it's interfaced with Instagram, is probably the way in 5 years' time that we will receive just about all information about art, unless you happen to be a gallery goer. But it has to be driven from the top. It doesn't matter how loud people shout from the bottom. It seems as though it doesn't happen because people have been shouting since the 60s about it. Next question. Let's go to the back because all the people at the front are getting the opportunity. Find somebody with a hand up near the back and we'll work our way back here.
Hi, and thank you for everyone who spoke. I just wanted to make a comment really about, I guess, in relation to my own education. I was taught at Edinburgh University where I studied art history, and then went to the Slade where I worked with Estelle and I produced the pamphlet she mentioned earlier. And I felt that actually contemporary art helped me out massively when reading paintings from the past. I remember being in seminars in Edinburgh. I was from a rural school, state school, and there were a lot of very confident students there, and they talked a huge amount about what they saw, and they always placed symbolic value on the objects that they described. And I felt very much that so much of the time these objects were there due to formal reasons. They balanced things out. They threw colour, they threw your eye around, they threw focus. And I felt I had learnt that from looking at contemporary painting and abstract painting. And so often there seems to be this gulf between kind of art that we see in institutions like this and then works in the Tate Modern or works that are being kind of shown at supremely contemporary galleries. And I just think both could help each other out so much if paintings such as the ones we see on the walls are spoken about as in the way that students talk about their own works in studios and contemporary art schools, when they talk about, which was mentioned earlier, about when a painting might be finished, they talk about the struggles that they had, because we can kind of reference all the narratives and the religious and kind of social influences upon these paintings, but what makes works iconic is surely their organisation of colour, shape and form, and that, to be able to recognise that, is a confidence in your own vision. And I think kind of almost children have it, and then they lose it when they feel that describing what they see is not enough. It needs to be intellectualised, it needs to be somehow kind of laden with clear research that has read exterior to the experience of the image. So I wonder if we can actually make art history more relevant by looking at it in the way that it probably was always looked at, but in the way we look at contemporary paintings and the way we discuss painting in art schools.
Anybody like to bash at that?
That's beautifully put, a really, really good point. And actually, one of the things I'm doing at the moment is working with an old master dealer, because he wants to make old master paintings sexy in the way that contemporary art are. You know, there was a Tintoretto that sold at auction, I think, 2 years ago. It belonged to David Bowie. It sold for £100,000. It's peanuts. It was a good one as well. And you think about something like a Jeff Koons and what that would sell for. Now, this dealer has sort of honest, good interests at heart, because he actually really cares about good old-fashioned Spanish painting. But he's trying to approach it from that end in exactly that way you described.
No, I mean, back to the point I made earlier, which is that English collections just ran out of money and they caused the fracture. You know, it wasn't intentional, I don't think. I don't think we were revolted by modern art. We just didn't buy it. And so if this were the Corcoran collection, there would be some rooms with Jackson Pollock in, Barnett Newman, and there would be some American Cubism, maybe Stuart Davis, and there would be a continuum that starts in Europe and ends up as thoroughly American. And what we've got here is one that starts in Europe and ends in Europe. And
what about the Government Art Collection and the Arts Council? They have collections, they go on commissioning work, don't they? And yet it's not very readily available to the public.
Well, no, because they're working collections. You see, these are teaching collections. The collection in the Ashmolean is a teaching collection, and they were, but the collections by the British Council and the Arts Council are working collections, which, in theory, can be sent out on loan until they fall apart. I mean, you know, that has always been.
I mean, that said, I actually was part of an exhibition that was up at Yorkshire Sculpture Park last year, which was a young British artist, Rana Begum, who I taught at the Slade, who selected from the Arts Council collection, and so it was on display. So there are counter examples. I mean,
but it's not a teaching collection, so it doesn't have this story. What it is, it's a pot of goodies that people dig into to lend to other people to help them tell their story. It isn't a story in itself.
That's quite a nice parallel possibility.
It's a fantastic thing, but it's entirely different from this collection.
It's also still mainly British, isn't it? Both of them, they're focused on British
well,
artists.
I think they're supposed to be.
I think I've never thought about what you just mentioned before about that stop of purchasing, but I've been doing a lot of research on Art UK website recently because they have all the paintings in all the museums across the UK, looking at a certain theme that I've been looking for. And what I've not been able to get over is how it just stops art just isn't present after 1935 in most regional museums, 45. It's post-war. It's the fact that these museums stop having money to spend on acquisitions, and also there wasn't the philanthropy, the local philanthropy, and you suddenly then see a jump to the collections that have work from the 80s and 90s, and it's very local, it's very sort of amateur actually, and not particularly very good. So there is this sort of dropping off, which I don't think we've even begun to feel the impact of actually. I think we'll feel it in another 50 years' time.
I think
some of those collections were disbanded because of the cost of just simply managing and storing.
Well, these are museums that are still there. They're still open.
Strangely, you'd be horrified to know, I know this from personal experience, and a good friend, artworks bought, bought within the 80s, which were then, removed from collection, which is horrendous.
Sacrosanct, yeah.
We've got another question coming here. Second row on the left, and then the one at the back afterwards. Where's the back?
I just wanted to say one little thing in relation to what you said, was that pre-1935, of course, it's quite difficult to find lots of art on the internet before a certain date. Even people aren't uploading images. So equally, our students and young people encountering art on the internet, of course, have, there's a ghost period of art where things weren't digitized and captured. So there's equally that sort of black hole that's quite curious.
I tell you what, it's interesting. If you go onto the Tate site, this was true 2 years ago. They may have changed it. If you go onto the Tate site and type in as a search tool women artists, you get a load of pictures of women. You don't get paintings and sculpture by women. They might have fixed it by now. It's worth looking. Please, your question.
Thanks. I've been very relieved to hear the discussion today because for many years now, I realise at work, I've been feeling anachronistic because I run the art history course at Liverpool John Moores University, so a widening participation university. And I'm under pressure all the time from managers and peers. They don't really believe in the value of art history at all. So to hear that people are reconsidering it and trying to push its value forward has been really heartening. And my question then is, as a result of all these symposia and discussions, are there projected measures going forward then to try and change the situation? What's the outcome from today?
Mike, you better field that.
Lead the revolution.
Yeah, well, we are trying to lead the revolution, but we want to influence people, and the first way we want to influence people is gaining a number of viewpoints from experts, interacting with audiences. We hope to publish that. We hope to get people from politics eventually to come to some of our lectures so that they hear what's going on. And we did invite a number of leading politicians in the UK to come today, but they said there was something more important that was on their head, and my response to them was, well, if you came, you might just get a bit of sense in your heads, and be able to not vote. or vote in the right way. And as I'm going on the march on the weekend, you know what I think about the right way is. Anyway, so but we are trying to influence, and the next stage actually within the conference is that we go out to Washington on I think it's April the 22nd with Nicola Gardini, who's the professor of Italian in Oxford, who's giving a lecture over in Washington, and then we've got another one in Washington in October. We'll have another one, I hope, related to the politicians, thinking that the Brexit is over in autumn, probably here in London. That's being discussed at the moment. I have to say, I really am very grateful to Georgetown for the way that they've supported this and they've put money into this. And also to say my experience at Georgetown, of the teaching in Georgetown, is also extremely good, which I didn't mention, but I've been teaching in Georgetown since 1987, off and on. And so I'm not saying my teaching is good, but my colleagues' teaching has been very good there. Yeah.
Now, we've probably got time for a couple more questions. There was somebody at the back. There we are. 1, 2. There's a lady in pink, just there. Don't take it back to Liverpool.
I'm just going to stand up over here. I'd just like to give a little shout out for the grassroots, as you were saying, Kathleen, over there. I think the people that we've missed out in this equation really are teachers, and teachers right from early years, because teachers are extremely enthusiastic about their passions, but of course they're not given any enrichment nowadays at all. You know, they're just expected to get children through tests, and their education, as far as becoming a teacher is concerned, finishes, you know, as soon as they've done their PGCE. They get very little enrichment after that. An institution like this tries to, you know, make arrangements with teachers, make relationships with teachers to keep their enthusiasms going. I don't think they're badly educated at all. I just think they need much more, you know, help and support. If you go into any of the local estate schools, coming back to the portraits, you know, you see that every young person's education seems to start with painting a portrait of themselves, all about finding their self-identity. You go around all the schools, and there's, you know, portraits of every teenager sort of around the walls and in schools earlier. And if we're going to teach art history, we just need a better vocabulary. I opened my T.S. Eliot, coming back to your point about Shakespeare, this morning, in order to try and say something intelligent at a group I'm going to on Thursday, and I thought, God, where to start? You know, what do I know? What has my education in literature given me that I can bring to this? We all need much more of a background and much more good teaching. You know, I think we need to support our teachers much better. You know, we're going to close schools now on Friday afternoons. That's the latest. That goes back right to politicians. You know, we've got to provide more money in the system. Otherwise, the first thing that will go when we cut out Friday afternoon is the arts.
Thank you. There's one there. Okay, This is the penultimate question, and the last question is the person in the third row on my right at the front.
At the beginning of the afternoon, we were told about one of the beautiful paintings in the first room. And as an artist, I paint myself. And one of the questions was, when is a painting truly finished? Now, to me, just in terms of art context, it's when I make my next mark and I stand the risk of spoiling the actual work so far. To those that paint on the panel, when do they consider their works actually finished? Or how?
There we are.
Jolly difficult. I mean, with portraits, it's usually that you've got a limited time frame because people are not going to give you more than 2 extra sittings after the number you've asked for in the first place. Funnily enough, when I paint people, as I do, that are not commissioned, and can go on, I can kill them off. I can still do that, unfortunately. Artistically, I mean. Well, it's finished when you've said enough for the painting to be moving to you when you come across it by mistake. So I stick the works I'm working on around the house very often, and certainly in odd places in the studio, leaning in a corner or something like that. I remember one of my tutors saying, he put a painting up on the wall. This was Keith Vaughan. He put a painting up on the wall, and it would miraculously finish itself. And it's only now, several decades later, that I scorned this at the time. But I know what he means, that leaving a gap in what you might have done allows the viewer to get into the work sometimes. And it almost demonstrates that things cannot be finished. You actually cannot join up all the dots. That's, in a way, to come back to the experience of looking and spending some time looking at something, which is different to just not falling over things that are in your way and looking at them in that sense. But that concentrated looking, you see the mystery. I don't have any religious belief, but I can see the mystery because I can try and try and try, and I've spent my entire life trying to get, quite often I paint bricks, not people. I love painting bricks. You can't actually get there. There's too much change. There's too much, it's too grand a question as to what is there. And so I think the painting is finished, and I wish there was a formula, don't you, that said, but I suspect, I'm beginning to suspect that it's when there is still something to do, but you've done an awful lot, you've digested an awful lot.
Okay. It's like finishing sentences, isn't it?
Sorry.
It's very difficult. Estelle, do you want to go for that?
Likewise, it is, I suppose, when I surprise myself, is perhaps an ambition, and when something happens that it's difficult to articulate, but somehow, the wholeness of what I have made doesn't lead me to want to do anything more to it. That said, it's very, very rare. And I have been known to exhibit works and then come back into the studio and be repainted. And so that question of I think there's finished and there's really finished. And again, the conversation about the Rembrandt today, there are very few paintings in the world that, can tick all of those boxes. But we know when we see them, and it's a collective thing, and that's true for makers as well. You know when something has really got somewhere, I'm not saying there, but as near to there as you're able to get, and sometimes not. But I suppose it's one, that something happens that surprises me, and two, that I simply can't see what else would change that.
Good. 2 points. One of them is that I was at the Requiem Mass for Peter Greenham, who was the head of the Royal Academy Schools. And a friend of his, who I can't remember who it was, but an artist, read a letter that he'd sent him. And it finished up with, at 4 o'clock this afternoon, I had probably painted the best painting I've ever painted. By 6 p.m. it was in a garbage can. Such is life. And that final question, just here, and then we must break. It's going to have to be a really quick one. So if you can turn it into a tight question and give everybody a chance.
Well, like a lot of questions, it's not quite a question. Well, what I get from this is with 2.6 million people in England in the creative arts industry, the arts seem alive and well. And that's hugely encouraging. That's what I take away. And yet the questions like yours on the ground, experience of people like me, is that their children are missing out. If you had a great football player who was 5 years old, there would be after-school clubs and he'd be doing a lot at school. Where is the drawing teaching? Because it's absolutely right, every child should draw. I love Ruskin saying that. Where is that? And where is the history of art that everybody needs? We had a cultural loss of confidence that meant we couldn't teach history of art because somehow it was elitist, which is shocking. I think if we fail, if this conference fails, there should be a huge voluntary effort. These are times of austerity. Anybody with a love of art or an ability to paint should go to their nearest primary school, start an after-school club, and help the next generation to grow into artists as good as some of the artists we're looking at the table today.
You're absolutely right.
I now feel like the harbinger of doom. My daughter works in publishing, goes off one lunchtime a week to read to children who don't read well, and has enjoyed the experience, found it really interesting. The school obviously facilitated it in conjunction with the publishers. My experience when I very briefly was in charge of a faculty of Arts and Humanities was that one of the programs that we tried really hard to do when we had this open forum was to engage schools and to draw them in. I, of course, in that role, wanted to do it both to tick the boxes, but also because I believed in it. It was impossible because the schools they were so sort of under-resourced and overworked, and the curriculum just didn't allow any time or space for it. I agree with you, it should happen, but it really does.
Sorry to interrupt, but after-school clubs used to be a thriving thing which parents did, so the community did it, so artists in the local would come and give their time, nothing to do with the curriculum, school premises is there, and children flock to that. So
perpetuates this sense of it as a soft option. We just, that 2.6 million that we currently have is because of the investment in the past. And what I'm talking about is a warning sound, really, that we're not investing now, which means we're going to fall over in about 10 years' time. And especially because we know that the skills that you get through learning about the arts are the very skills that we are going to need going forward. And we need professional investment. I completely agree. The idea of communities is super important, but we mustn't undermine the value of it by making it only volunteer and community-led. It needs to be done professionally too.
Very good. Thank you.
With that, first of all, thank you, the audience, for being here this afternoon. It's been a splendid afternoon as far as I'm concerned, listening to the comments coming from the audience. Can I thank our four speakers for engaging us in this debate. We now pause for an hour. There's tea in the cafe, the refurbished cafe, I understand. There's tea there for you. And then at 5:30, Gabriele Finaldi is giving a lecture, the director of the National Gallery. The whole point of this is to show the academic integrity of fine art in practice in the context of the lecture that Gabriele is going to give to us. If you haven't got a ticket for the 5:30 lecture, I understand that, I'm looking at the back, I understand that there are some tickets still available. So if you see Kinga at the back, or one of the people who's helping us at the back, you can get a ticket for the lecture at 5:30. The lecture is not in here. The lecture is in the lecture room, which holds more people. That's why we can say there are maybe a few tickets left if you haven't ordered them. So with that, our thanks, please, to the speakers. Thank you very much.